I would like to start with reading the scripture, which is Genesis 22, and I'll read verses 1 through 7. And it reads, "Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham.' And Abraham said, 'Here I am.' Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you.' Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, 'Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you.' Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 men went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, 'Father?' 'Yes, my son,' Abraham replied. 'The fire and the wood are here,' Isaac said, 'but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?'" The title of this sermon will be "Obedience is Better Than the Sacrifice." If you would visualize this for me. It's morning. The dew is freshly drizzled on the blades of grass as their feet pound the ground. In the silence of the morning, the Lord speaks to Abraham as he and Isaac tread up the side of the mountain. Wretched with anxiety, Abraham feels the tightening in his chest of what is about to happen. But he presses forward because he loves the Lord. Abraham looks down at Isaac for what he feels is the last time, even though his spirit has declared otherwise. Isaac looks up at his father and smiles, not knowing specifically what all this is about, yet trusting his father to lead. Abraham presses on towards the spot where God has deemed this sacrifice to happen. He holds Isaac's hand with firmness and gentleness all at the same time. As they reach the mountainside, Abraham sees the altar for the offering that he built 3 days prior. A single tear trickles down his cheek. He wipes it away quickly before Isaac can see it. He wants his son to understand that obedience to God is more important than any human emotion. He thinks the thought obedience is better than the sacrifice. Abraham is displaying in this passage that obedience is truly better than a sacrifice. And in the end, God proves it to be so. God has spoken that Isaac is to be offered up as a burnt offering to test Abraham's obedience to God. And in that time, burnt offerings were symbols of total dedication to God. The offering had to be completely consumed by the fire so that it could not be used for anything else. The original Hebrew word for burnt offering is olah, which means ascend and to go upward. A sacrifice was only offered to God when total dedication needed to be shown. God needed to see how dedicated Abraham was. I can imagine that Abraham wondered why God would test him with the thing that mattered to him the most. Abraham had waited for the child of the promise, and even in his old age, he trusted God. But I wonder how much Abraham thought God had gone too far this time. There are times in our own lives when God tests us and asks us to sacrifice the very things that we hold dear. God does not do this to hurt us, but to refocus our attention solely on Him. How successful would you really be if God had not asked you to offer up something of your heart's desire to Him? God tests us. He tests our obedience in many ways that seem harsh to us. God needs to know where our allegiances lie. And even though Abraham was dedicated to God, this one area of his life was secluded away from God. By all means, this was the promise. This was the thing that you told me would happen. This was the thing that me and Sarai, later on Sarah, waited for. Why this thing? God tests our what in your life have you deemed off limits to God? What possessions have you asked God not to ask you for? What would cause you to make a hard decision if God asked you to sacrifice it to him? We have to remember that God asks us to give these sacrifices, but he always prepares us for the offering up of them. I lost my own car in 2012, around this time, actually. It was the one thing that I had left to define me. I didn't have expensive things or a lot of money in the bank. I was in seminary, and we all know how that goes with finances. But I did have a car, which I could use as a way to control where my life went. I remember the moments before it was repossessed. I had a talk with the leasing company. I had begged and pleaded and had been given some extensions on my payments. But all the while, God was preparing me for giving up my car as a sacrifice. The moment I told God that I wanted his will was the moment I transcended my own human want for an obedience to God. Abraham was very much so in the same boat. In chapter 17 of Genesis, God and Abraham make a covenant. And in that moment, Abraham activates the very obedience that wills him to take Isaac to the mountain. Although the covenant was geared toward circumcision, it embodied the wholeness of God's need for Abraham. It's weird to think that God needs us, but it's true. Without the obedience of Abraham, would we have such a graphic example of what surrendering to God's will really looked like? God has need of our obedience as well. He needs to know that we are willing to put aside our wants for his will. You have to sacrifice the lifestyle you wanted or thought you wanted to go to seminary. You had to sacrifice friendships so that you could grow in some areas. And you have to sacrifice your flesh daily in an effort to be a vessel for God and not a vice for his kingdom. Obedience to these things are key. And in the midst of Abraham walking in obedience, we find in verse 3 that he also brought along witnesses. 2 men came with him to the mountain where the sacrifice would take place. And whenever God asks you to make a sacrifice for him, he will allow there to be witnesses. He needs people to see what he is doing. The witnesses are mental scribers that can verify the glory of the Lord after the sacrifice has occurred. Abraham was sacrificing a part of himself, and there had to be a witness to that phenomenon. Witnesses carry the fruit of your labor to the fold. I can just see the witnesses running back to the town and announcing what God had done at the top of the mountain. Isaac wonders, where is the burnt offering as he lays on the altar? It's possible that he trusted his father in such a way that whatever his father was up to, he was on board. You see, your obedience to the unctioning of God does not just bring about things for you, but also it is the example for someone else coming after you. To answer Isaac's question, where is the lamb for the burnt offering? The burnt offering is anything that causes you to deny yourself for the sake of being obedient to God. Offering a sacrifice to God in obedience is a form of worship. It shows reverence to God's abundant being. The good news in all of this is that your obedience genuinely and specifically produces the hand of God to move. In verse 10, Abraham is committing the very act of obedience in verse 11. God sees the epic seriousness of Abraham's obedience in such a way that it proves to God that his obedience is more important to him than the sacrifice. When God sees that you will give up your prized possessions and the things you hold so dear to your heart just to see God's glory, he wastes no time coming to your rescue. Abraham teaches us that the sacrifice itself is not what's important, but is the very act of obedience, because obedience is better than the sacrifice. Thank you.